Okay. We're looking at the letter to the Philippians. It was in Acts. Do you all know about Luke, the writer? He wrote a gospel, and you see it in chapter 1 when he began. Luke was a doctor, a physician, a physical doctor. He was a medical doctor. And so he had a very high level of education. When we studied Greek in college, the Greek of the first century, Koine Greek they call it, Luke's letters were the last ones the teacher scheduled for us to read through, because the vocabulary and the word usage and the grammar were so difficult. It's difficult to learn a language if you jump right into the hardest, most difficult, the deepest vocabulary. You start with the easiest ones, the easiest lines to read and the easiest language. So you know which ones we started with? When we translated from Greek into English, we started with John's letters. His gospel and his 3 letters. He calls himself in 2nd and 3rd John the old man. And he was. It was at the end of the first century, and he was, by tradition, a very good, honest tradition in the early church and their writers. He was the only one of the 12 that Jesus appointed apostles during his ministry, because he appointed Paul as well. But John was the only one who died of natural causes. And he died a very old man. The Roman Empire didn't like him preaching this new religion, so they exiled him to the island of Patmos, and that's where he was when Jesus dictated the book of Revelation to him. But he died an extremely old man, and the reason why he was exiled instead of executed is because the Roman emperor did not have the heart to execute an old man. He took him out of circulation, so he thought. And there was, back in the 60s or the 70s, there was a video out with a very famous actor who played the part of John. It was a 1-actor play that was recorded. And it was John on the island of Patmos. This is the plot behind the video. The audience was a group of Christians that had been arrested for practicing this new religion, who were also banished to Patmos. And John was welcoming them to the island and explaining to them why he was there, and then preaching his gospel again. It was a very famous actor that did that. It was called St. John in Exile. It's a really good play to watch. Just understand that, the Bible doesn't give us all the details there were. We have to fill in the spaces. And when you read words on a page, you don't necessarily get the real picture of what's going on. So I like to personally try to visualize what it would have been like, the reaction of the other people, the reaction I would have had if I was there. And that's actually what the Hebrew word for remember means. Not to think back on a former activity. But when Jesus did Lord's Supper, and he said, "Do this to remember me," it was, think about the action that took place and put yourself in the action as if you were there, a witness. That's what the word remember that Jesus used with the Lord's Supper is. So we're not just thinking back to a guy dying on a cross. Would you have been at the foot of the cross? Would you have been on the sidelines like Peter was and John, sitting in the courtyard, but not necessarily inside where the action was taking place? Or would you have been the other disciples who turned and fled? Put yourself in the activity. Where would you have been? What would you have done? What would you have seen and heard? Because Jesus willingly went through it and did it. And at the end, proclaimed his victory over Satan by saying, "It's finished." Did it. So remember during Lord's Supper today and the other Sundays that we take it together, we're not looking at a dead guy. Jesus is alive. And the early church practiced it and remembered it as a celebration, not a time to be solemn and somber and quiet. And my mother wouldn't let us turn and look around at the other people during church. But it was a celebration, and they called it, Peter and Jude, both in their letters in the New Testament, call it the love feast. A feast, a celebration. Yeah, okay. Anyway, how did I get there? Luke. Luke was the writer of Acts because the introduction to both letters that he writes here is written to the same guy with the same phraseology. Luke chapter 1, verse 1. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So many of us have written stories and gospels here. And we've all gone to the source, the eyewitness source, to get the information. So Luke is going to do the very same thing. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, and that careful investigation is like putting it under a microscope, and he was a medical doctor. He put the information under a microscope to make sure it was true and accurate. It seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Theos, Philios, the God lover. So, whether that was the name of a person or he was writing to us 2,000 years later, those of us who love God, want to be a friend of God, he's written it down for us to know that this is true, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. That's how Luke begins his gospel, and he begins with very similar words in the book of Acts, which means this is probably the early church, when they put these letters together, didn't know what to call this letter. It could very easily have been Luke 2. That's what we do with our movies, right? How many Rockies have there been? Yeah. This could have easily been a sequel. Usually the biblical compilers would like 1st and 2nd Samuel. Even though Samuel dies in the 4th chapter of his first book, who wrote the rest of it? It's thought to have been Ezra, the chronicler, during the time of the exile. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. This could be 2nd Luke. But they didn't know what to call it. They didn't necessarily understand who the writer was at the time. So, well, it's the Acts of the Apostles, the actions, the doings, is literally what the Greek says. It's the doings. But if you read the beginning of this one, in my former book, Theophilus, I wrote all about what Jesus began to do and teach until the day he was taken up to heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. So it's obviously the second part of the Gospel of Luke. Now, what Luke was able to do, being a very educated person, these were the last letters we read in Greek class, because and even after having 2 years of Greek, our 3rd year we're reading from Luke and Acts, it was hard to figure out what he was saying, how to put a sentence together, because they don't have the same rules that English does. And so this is a highly educated person who is, and we have to be very fortunate that the Spirit guided Luke to write these two, because he puts these little clues in his writing that historians can use to date with accuracy when these things took place. And they can compare secular histories written by Romans and Greeks and Jews like Josephus, and they compare. So we can feel very confident that what Luke is writing here is accurate. Like the birth of Jesus took place during the time that Quirinius, the governor, ordered a census of the area. There was only one time that ever happened in any of the histories and the Romans write about it. And the Jews do too, because the Jews were mad. It was done for tax purposes. They wanted to know how many people were in the empire and how to set up their budget. The problem was they required everyone to go to their ancestral home where the births were recorded. So it had to be done during warm weather, not December. That opens up a lot of things. Luke pinpoints the timing when it was done. And that's why Mary and Joseph, both from the line of David, had to travel then while she was 8-9 months pregnant, riding on a donkey, some 300 miles down to their ancestral home, and why the place was so crowded that they had to spend the night in the barn. A lot of that opens up a lot of putting yourself into the story and what's going on. Luke does that by giving us these very significant details. And Luke was part of the action in this. This is the time period with the church in Philippi where Luke is part of the mission team. And it has been said by many historians and many commentators that the city of Troas was a very important medical university study location. So that does come up as to why even Luke was part of the team and why they even went to Troas. Because if you have a map, you'll wonder why they even went there. It's pretty much college towns and universities, even in this country, were established to be places out in the middle of nowhere for the students to have quiet, solitude. Basically, all they can do is study. And today, it's far different than that, isn't it? It's party time, isn't it? As one of the reasons why MCC, Michigan Christian College, which is now Rochester College, was pretty much in the middle of nowhere north of Detroit. You couldn't just wander out to a party place. We were isolated. But there was reason for that, is so you'd mind your time on studies. Anyway, it says here, it was during the second missionary tour. If you back up into 15, Paul took Silas and Timothy with him. Barnabas and Mark did not travel with them. We mentioned that last week. The reason for that is found here in chapter 15. In the previous missionary tour, Mark freaked out and went back home. For some reason, he doesn't say what. Barnabas, ever the encourager, Paul talks to him and says, come on, let's go back and visit the people, because the big issue at the time in the first century was whether or not Gentiles were accepted into the church. And there was a question here not too long ago about whether or not the law of Moses was for Gentiles. Was it only for Jews? Was that here? Someone asked me about that. God incorporated anybody who wanted to follow him. He did not set boundaries. God is inclusive, not exclusive. Salvation, if they follow what the law says, he says that is counted to them as righteousness. Even though they don't have the written law to follow. They do it because it's naturally known to be right. And who was it? Rahab was incorporated into the family. Ruth was incorporated into the family. Whole bunches of people, the Gibeonites, who pretended to be from a far country. They were incorporated and protected from being excluded because of their faith in God. He incorporated anybody who wanted to follow. His promise to Abraham was for all nations to be blessed, not just one. So everybody was included, but the big deal was whether or not Gentiles could be, and that was the big fight. That was the first fight in the church. And so in chapter 15, the apostles had met, came to the conclusion, yes, they are. And they listened to witnesses, Peter, for one, because of Cornelius. Peter had to be commanded to go and talk to the guy, to go to the guy's house. Remember the dream he had? Rise up, Peter, kill and eat. Oh no, this is a test. No, I know. We're not allowed to eat these animals. Don't you call it dirty if I've called it clean. And it happened 3 times before Cornelius' guys knocked at the door, and then Peter, okay, now I know what to do. See, this is how I dramatize what's going on here. You have to read between the lines because you don't get that with just the words on the page. Put yourself in the story, what would happen. And he got called on the carpet for it, didn't he? Jews want to know why he went into the house of a Gentile, a Roman soldier. How dare you? He said, God told me to. And Holy Spirit fell on them just like it did on us at the beginning. Remember the day of Pentecost? And everybody just look around the crowd and you could pick out the naysayers going, what else are we going to do? I guess if that's what happened, then it is okay. And they wrote this letter. Galatians would not have had to be written. We talked about that last week. If this had happened before his first letter was out. So Paul wanted to go back and deliver the letter and prove it to the people. Gentiles are accepted. So Barnabas says, come on, Mark, let's go along. Not him. He ditched us the first time. Barnabas said, oh, come on. He's had time to think about it. Give him time to grow. This is Barnabas you're talking about. And when you're dead set in your opinions and views, we don't like Barnabas's, do we? We don't like those guys meddling and changing things. They had a big fight, and they split. Paul took Timothy and Silas and went back to Asia. Barnabas took Mark and went right back to the territory where Mark had freaked out the first time. But later on in 2 Timothy, Paul is asking Timothy to come visit him and bring important things to him. And one of the things he needs, everybody's deserted him. Bring Mark. He's been very good to my ministry. Egg on his face, eating crow, whatever it is, Barnabas was right. Paul admits he was wrong. Mark had shown himself and proven himself. So Paul would have been a very difficult person to work with. But that is where this ministry in Philippi begins, is after this fight. 2 fights. One that is church-wide and one that is personal. And so this church was a big soothing effect for Paul for both of those reasons. And now a medical issue that has arisen. So, all right. He came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived. Timothy's mother was Jewish and a believer, but his father was Greek. And he was not allowed to practice the Jewish stuff, even though his mother did. And in one of the letters to Timothy, Paul talks about the influence his mother and grandmother, Lois, had on his growth. He went ahead and had Timothy circumcised. Wait a second. Didn't they just say you didn't have to be circumcised to be saved? But he did it because Timothy was a very timid individual. And you see that in the things that he writes to him in his letters. And just to give him, bolster his courage and the groups that he would be talking to, knowing he is not Jewish. Set that issue aside. So Paul is even learning himself how to get along with other people here. All right. Let's see. They went to town. Verse 6, and this is in 16 of the book of Acts. Paul and his companions traveled throughout the region of Phrygia and Galatia, which is what we know as Asia Minor today. Turkey is where that is today. Having been kept by the Spirit from preaching the word in the province of Asia. Wouldn't you want to go to the most populous area with this message? Of course you would. And it's right there. Now, how the Spirit prevented them, we have no idea. Some will claim that because of where he ended up, Paul might have fell ill. Well, we got to get him to an urgent care. Well, you're not going to find that in Asia. They headed that direction then. Well, they came to the border of Mysia, Again, you'd have to look at a map. Some Bibles have that in the back or the front. You can see where these areas are. They tried to enter Bithynia, again, going up toward the Black Sea area. But the Spirit of Jesus would not allow them to. How that happened, again, it doesn't say. We're left to speculation. If you go with the other speculation that it is, Paul might have had a very serious medical issue here. I'm just guessing. I don't know. He talks about the thorn in his flesh. Take it away. God says, no. Because that thorn in your flesh reminds you of who's in charge here. Yeah. Otherwise, it's not there and you're doing a great job. Who gets all the credit? See? No. That's a reminder. Okay. So, why they were prevented from going into Bithynia? Don't know. But they passed through Mysia and came to Troas. Medical university in the first century. One of the renowned medical universities. And during the night, Paul had a vision. You see, twice he thought he knew where the best place to go was. Nope, go this way. Up here, this is where, nope, this way. And so in the night, God fills him in. Man from Macedonia, dressed like a Macedonian. Come on over to Macedonia and help us. Okay. Paul now knows where God wants him to go. And God does that, doesn't he? We try to figure out with clues where we're supposed to go, and things just don't work out, do they? Okay, and we just follow the open doors. We just follow what's in front of us. And Paul had the advantage of having a vision. Well, during the night, let's see, in verse 10 then, after Paul had seen the vision, here's what changes in the dialogue in the book of Acts. We got ready at once to leave for Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. You see the difference? Before that was Paul went here with these guys and they did this and they did that. Now it's we decided and us. Now Luke is part of the mission team. Paul has a doctor traveling with him now. And God probably knew Luke had an open heart and he was open for salvation. And God does that. He leads us to certain people that he knows are looking. And he gives them an opportunity by having us there. And in Macedonia, this was one of the greatest congregations for Paul's ministry. All right, what do we know? Now go to the outline here, just some tidbits of information. It was a Roman colony. That tells us a lot of history in just that one simple phrase. Luke is telling us why it's an important place. A Roman colony. They were populated by ex-military officers who were given land in those territories as a reward for their service. But what it did was make sure that there were places throughout the Roman Empire that were very pro-Roman. They were along the road systems. When you had the ex-military guys there's probably a garrison of soldiers. A highly protected area. Probably armories and everything else. The only problem with a Roman colony comes up when Paul gets there to visit. Anyway, this was named for the father of Alexander the Great. Philip II of Macedon, who was a very gifted soldier in the Greek army and had his son Alexander schooled in the best philosophy schools of the day, Aristotle, Socrates, and all of them. Alexander was 3 times the commander and what do you call a guy who's very strategic? Yes, there you go. That his father was. Conquered the whole known world at the time of his day when he was 32 years old. Died in a drunken stupor. They think he fell into a ditch with some water in it and drown. Because his soldiers, they had gone to the outer reaches of everything they knew to be the world. And then said, okay, can we go home now? Alexander wasn't done. Okay, anyway, it was a wealthy gold mining town, as it started out to be. By the time Paul gets there, though, the mines had dried out, they claim. Honored soldiers were given land ownership there. The residents were extremely proud of their Roman citizenship. So, all other cultural events were not allowed within the city precincts. You wonder why other religions were not allowed in certain cultures, and it was because there's a very true statement that's out there, 100% true. Most wars are fought for a religious purpose. How do you get guys to give up their life? How do you get them to surrender their life for a cause? You make it something based on their faith. And so Romans had a faith system that elevated the emperor in his position. And in order to protect that, you had to have them in line with the gods. All nations had their gods, and the one nation that conquered another, their god was stronger. You can see that all throughout Israel's history. Sennacherib was fighting against Judah at the time. I think it was King Jehoshaphat, wasn't it? Or was it Hezekiah? He had conquered everybody. But there was a little forest fire over here he had to put out first, and he didn't want to take time for Judah, and so he sent his second in command to sue for peace. Yeah, and he says, what God has been able to stand against my master? You think you're going to hold up in your city walls and escape? And I think it was Hezekiah, and that's when Hezekiah basically showed his faith and turned to God. And they got wiped out. Sennacherib and the Assyrians were wiped out. But that was the philosophy of the day. So if any other cultural god came in and was worshipped in town, that was seen as dirtying the holy place. And so these Roman colonies that were supposed to be very pro-Roman excluded anything that was not Roman. And that included the Jews, Judaism. So they were not allowed inside the city precincts. You can go down by the river if you want to worship your God. Worship foreign gods was outlawed. Usually when Paul went into a place to start a mission, where did he go? One place. Synagogue required 10 Jewish men of high upstanding faith. And you get the list that Paul lists for Timothy, for elders. Those are what from the middle second century were written for synagogue rulers to establish a synagogue and keep it running. Paul did not make up that list of who's above reproach. Now, that came out of the synagogue. The church was based on the synagogue, and the synagogue was everything to Jewish life. So Paul went to the synagogue, not necessarily because there was religious activities going on or that he could preach or people were listening. He went there so he could get a meal and so he could have a bed for the night. And then, just so happens, on the Sabbath, when they come together for their Bible study, then he could preach the gospel to them. That's why he went to the synagogue, though. And anyway, he got there on the second missionary tour in the early 50s. Luke does give some descriptions there of what's going on at the time that they can pinpoint with accuracy the time period, even when he was there. Silas and Timothy were his partners. Already talked about that. The Spirit prevented them from going into Asia and Bithynia, and then he went through Troas and had the vision. And then the mission team begins with the we, which means that Luke was involved. The first inference of anything religious there, though, comes, verse 13. It was on the Sabbath, and we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. So in these colonies that excluded Judaism, it was common among believers of God that they would gather by the riverside. where they could pray. And where eventually somebody would come in with some information and have discussions with them. Not necessarily preaching as we know it today, where it's a lecture we all sit and listen to quietly. Paul did not preach until midnight in the city of Troas when Eutychus fell out the window. He did not preach. The Greek word there is dialogue, not kerux, which is our form of preaching. The dialogue is a two-way discussion. It's what we're doing right now. They had Bible class, and that's why it lasted till midnight. But they also kept Paul there because he had some information they needed to know, and he was leaving the next day. And it was at night, after they'd worked all day, and it was in the springtime, and Eutychus was in the window, and the lights were burning with candles, and it got a little warm. How do you feel after a long shift at work? And he fell out the window. And then they took him up, and then they had their love feast, and then Paul and the team left. Yeah.
It's difficult for us in our modern age today to understand how important it was for them to come together for these studies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you go back to the Rush Arbor days, you know, the 1800s here, early 1900s, some of that. But when we were in Africa, we would have, you know, the sermon part, the worship part of the service. Then we would have a Bible study after. And it could go on 2-3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I said, guys, you know, I'm going to quit. That's it.
I'm worn out. Yeah.
I mean, it just question after question after question.
Mm-hmm.
We discussed about it. But this was where they came together to learn and get their questions answered.
Right. Yeah.
And
The preaching wasn't established for that. Preaching was established during the Restoration period, actually, to get people out of denominationalism and into trying to be the church Jesus established. But the actual learning and discussions took place.
Yeah, you don't have that happen here, but you know, often you come to your conclusion. They say, no, keep going.
Well, and Jesus, when he visited the synagogue, they asked him to read from Isaiah, and so he did. Sat down, and they expected a Bible study. They didn't care for what he had to say, though. He read from Isaiah, and he said, "See that passage right there? Talking about me. Who do you think you are?" Big riot. They tried to toss him off the cliff there at the city. Tried to kill him.
I think that, that's a mistake. You look at the synagogues, they study.
Mm-hmm.
They study. Today, we have equated evangelism with the sermon on Sunday morning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's so different. Yeah.
And I remember in one place I was, and we're running out of time again. Good stuff here with the history and learning and all that. Where the Bible class had gone long, and this one person complained vehemently. "We come together for worship, and here you are having a Bible study. Why do we have to wait for your Bible study?" And when I explained to her what happened at Troas, it was like the people when the Gentiles were accepted, and it was like, ugh. Didn't preach. They came together for worship, but they had a Bible study till midnight, and they only got back to the worship after Eutychus fell out of the window, and they took him back up. So they put worship on hold for their Bible study. We got it backwards, don't we? Anyway. All right. First person they're going to see is a Jewish believer, and the reason why it says believer is because she was not Jewish. Because believers were Gentiles who had accepted the Jewish religion and were incorporated into the family then. And that was Lydia. So the church there began, sorry for you guys, this might anger you, church there began with a woman. And a leader in the church, Paul calls her a little later on. Also, an imprisonment. You can go ahead, read ahead if you want to. I'll let you. Not like I can keep you from
mention just real quick.
Yeah.
You keep referring to the fact that what they saw, what they heard, maybe we don't see it here. We've been watching off and on for the last while a series called The Chosen, It's about the life of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And because they make it real. This week we were watching a section that was on the Sermon on the Mount. And he's speaking to people, and people are commenting to one another about, did you hear what he said? And the Pharisees are standing in the back, scrutinizing everything he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it gives you a different understanding of how people were actually related to what he said when he was saying it.
Yeah, I remember I might have seen a piece of that, but they're all asking Jesus, stuff like that, and he said, "Okay, you remember John? What'd you go out into the wilderness to see? A man dressed in fine clothes?" And everybody looks at him. Because you remember how he was dressed? Goat skin with a leather belt? And everybody's just cracking up. He had the audience in the palm of his hand. Yeah, that might have been part of that series. I don't know. Okay. Anyway, we'll pick up from there. I know you might not like to get the history in the background, but you have to trust me. It's very important to understand why he wrote what he did in this letter is all based on their history together. And Luke gives us a really good history of this church, especially because, first of all, it was Luke's first experience. And this church never forgot or was away from the mission team afterwards. They held with Paul beyond Paul's execution. So it's very important to see the history behind it. So, all right.